All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for our evening and final session for ILOC 2023. I'm Bonnie McEwen with the State Library. I'm with the Northwest District Office. And you have seen my colleague, Sam Bowers, throughout the day, bouncing from Zoom room to Zoom room, making sure that the conference went off without a hitch. And I think it did. So I really want to take just a minute to acknowledge all the work that Sam has put into this ambitious event. Um, Before we log out at 7 o'clock, we will be sure to pop the link to the conference survey into the chat space. We would love for you to fill out that survey for us. And also, we hope that you will use the chat space in our time together this evening to pose any questions that you might have for our speaker tonight. So it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's keynote speaker, Dr. David Peters. Dr. Peters is a professor of sociology and an extension rural socialist at Iowa State University.
Sociologist.
Sociologist.
No, I often get acute when I go into small communities and usually talk with farm populations. That's kind of the running joke, from Iowa State. You're the rural socialist.
Socialist.
Yeah, sociologist.
Sociologist would be the right term there. His work encompasses social and economic change in rural communities. His specific research areas include rural population and health, rural poverty and inequality, and rural crime. His research has been published in many top-tiered journals, and among other duties, he is the faculty advisor for the Agricultural and Rural Policy Studies major at ISU. He also teaches courses in rural sociology and applied statistics. So his is an impressive resume, and we are so looking forward to his presentation tonight, which is titled Why Leadership and Libraries Matter for Rural Vitality. He has insights to share with us from a survey conducted for the Iowa Small Towns Project, which is all about how small towns can engage newcomers in community efforts. We're happy to have you here, Dr. Peters. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bonnie. Go by Dave, but yep, thank you for the introduction. I guess the title. I'll go right into it. Now it's not advancing.
We'll need you to start the screen share again as well, sir.
Yep. So you see the About Me slide. Everyone's.
Nope. We'll need you to share your screen again.
Oh.
Wonderful.
So there. Are we
Yep.
on the About Me? Okay, perfect. You think everyone had this figured out with COVID, but right. So Dave Peters, professor of rural sociology. Again, as Bonnie said, I study social change in small towns and farm populations, and I have an extension appointment where I go around communities in the state talking about the various issues that they face, whether that's with population loss, whether that's with fast population growth due to the expansion of meat processing plants, economic changes in the community. That's really what my extension appointment does. In addition, on the academic side, I'm the advisor for the Agricultural and Rural Policy Studies undergraduate major. We have about 70 students that are interested in aspects of ag policy and rural development policy. From Minnesota originally, so I'm a transplant. I was a mediocre hockey player. I'm a big hockey player. I play in the men's league in Des Moines. I'm not playing this year, but past 15, 16 years. I played on the men's league. I was a mediocre player up in Minnesota, but here in central Iowa, I'm pretty good on the ice. I'm an honorary, as I say, Colombiano. My wife is from Colombia. She came here in high school to the United States, so been down there a bunch of times, and we have friends that are from Colombia in the Des Moines area, so kind of engaged in that side of things. And then just kind of unrelated, they always tell us to give sort of a fun fact. about what you do with your time. So I have this old truck, 94 F-250 that I bought. I'm an ag econ undergrad major, and I was working for Harbor States Cooperative at the time. So my splurge was I bought this truck. It's long beds, extended cab. It's kind of a beast, and so it's a nice shade of blue. So I've been trying to keep that going. 300,000 miles, that's the goal. And so even though my wife is maybe not all that, it's in the garage now to protect it from the snow. So she quite doesn't like that, but I guess we all have to make allowances for our spouses. So I guess I'll get on with the presentation. So in a lot of the work that I do in rural Iowa, I get a couple questions about leadership. So they say, Extension is telling us we need better leaders, that leadership will help solve some of the issues we face. And so they wondered, is leadership really going to enhance quality of life? If we really kind of seek to better engage on the leadership side of things, is that going to help us become a community that's thriving? Will it be worth our effort to do that? Will we become a thriving place, or will we continue to struggle? And then obviously from a politician's point of view, a local elected politician, they want to know, if I'm going to change my leadership style, or if the city council is going to change its leadership style, what's the tangible result? Are we going to get more jobs? Are more people going to come to our community? So all of these are questions that I get pretty often. So I thought I would use some of the existing data we have to try to answer some of those questions, and that's what I'll be presenting to you here tonight. And then lastly, in terms of the role of libraries, there's a lot of evidence that we found that libraries are kind of a key place to facilitate leadership and civic engagement. That kind of all factors into this. So we'll be talking to that as well. So why does leadership and why do libraries matter for small towns? Well, first, having a good leadership and having libraries that are there for people to engage really allows local government to identify the relevant needs of the community. And once those needs are identified, good leaders and a public space to talk about these things, which libraries offer, allows a way for residents to engage in the community and to try to actually make things happen, make projects happen. And then obviously having access to data and understanding information is so critical these days, and that libraries can play a pretty key role in helping local leaders find that information, understand that information, so small towns make smart decisions. So as I say at the bottom, libraries can play a very key role in developing leaders and facilitating kind of engagement of residents to try to engage in those projects that improve quality of life. Now, so I've been talking a little bit so far about leadership. And so you might ask, well, my community has leaders, or every town has leaders. Isn't that enough? You're talking about more leaders. And really the answer to that is it's not really the number of leaders that matters, really the leadership style of those individuals that is so critical. And so before we used to think we needed more leaders, get more leaders involved, that's good. And what the research has shown over the decades is that you really don't need that many leaders, but you need people that engage in this certain style of leadership that we call shared, that the literature calls shared leadership. So in the shared leadership model, it's the process that matters. That really these leaders try to use their influence, try to use their communication skills to engage residents to come together to work on shared projects and shared goals. So what the shared leader does is try to engage people, find out what their needs are, and then try to move people forward to address a shared goal. And instead of sort of giving orders or telling people what to do, they really are sort of guides. They're used as a resource, and they really want other leaders to take leads on certain particular projects, and they just sort of guide the process. And they try to do this through a very two-way communication where people working on the projects can communicate with the leaders, and the leaders can communicate back to the people actually doing the projects. So really this iterative process, talking with local residents and leaders talking with residents and residents talking with leaders is really the kind of essence of the shared leadership. And what we find is that this style of leadership really tends to foster a lot of creativity and self-direction among people leading these organizations. So it's really good for small communities where you have to rely on volunteers. If people are there on their own volition, they need to feel like they have some input into the process, and the projects they're working on are going to have some benefit to them. Now, you might ask, why don't people do this anyway? Well, two main reasons they don't do that is, one, it's very time consuming. And of course, the other reason is a lot of leaders don't like to give up control, because it's a bit frightening when you delegate a lot of this activity. You know, the end result can be uncertain. The alternative to that, or the most common leadership, is what we call this closed leadership style, or this very traditional leadership style. And that's really based on the individual traits of the leader. So I have the most expert knowledge, or I was elected into this position. That's sort of the basis of leadership, not really their characteristics as a leader. And in the closed leadership model, these leaders use their formal authority over people to really kind of issue orders and directions from the top down. So there really isn't any of this two-way communication. And so in community work, we really kind of encourage communities to not take this closed leadership style. But however, there are circumstances where you want this kind of closed leadership. This would be, you know, in the military or in emergency management. When public safety is key, then you need to make quick decisions. But when you're relying on volunteers, if things are very top down and you're not listening to people, the issue is that people become very disengaged very quickly, and people just don't show up to volunteer. And so the shared leadership, what we at Iowa State and leadership people talk about, is that why it's so critical is that, you know, the challenges facing small communities, really any communities, but particularly smaller communities in our state, you know, they're big problems that are going to require really innovative solutions and really entrepreneurial solutions. Because there isn't a lot of money from state government and there isn't a lot of money from federal government, oftentimes you might not have a large enough private sector to address these issues. You have to be creative in how you do things, and that means everyone needs to get involved. You need to be able to pool resources in smaller communities that maybe, you know, only have 500, 600 people. You really need to have, you know, almost everyone involved in these projects. And so shared leadership is a way to facilitate this. Also, you know, I would say in the 21st century, you know, people expect to be involved, expect to be informed. You know, unfortunately, that doesn't always mean that they volunteer all the time, but they want to be informed of the process. They generally want to have a say in things. So that's just an important way to do it. And of course, you know, given that society is changing fast, it's much more complex than what it was. You know, having a leadership model from the 1950s and 1960s really is kind of outdated in the 21st century. So there's really kind of a critical need now to think differently about how we lead our communities and our organizations. And in terms of the library, you know, information is the currency in the 21st century. If you think about any, you know, multi-trillion-dollar firm, you know, the social media sites of the world, their value is based on their data and their information. That's the value that they produce. And for smaller communities, understanding information, having a way to bring new ideas into the community, that's something that a library is uniquely situated to do, that they're best suited to do that. Find out what other towns are doing, what other towns across the country are doing, finding those ideas and bringing them into the community, and also being able to access and understand data, as I mentioned before. So what I'm going to present in the next couple of slides is essentially the argument, making the case using a couple data sources for how these towns that are characterized by shared leadership are more socially developed and economically developed than communities that have this closed leadership style. And so, as Bonnie mentioned, one of the things that I do is manage this Iowa Small Towns Project, where we survey 99 small towns across the state. That's one for each county, and we've been doing that since the mid-90s. Our next wave is in 2024. So we ask people perceptions about their town. What do you think of your leaders? What do you think about the services in your town. And so for this project, I eliminated the larger communities. So I'm only looking at towns under 6,000 people in the state. And then myself, along with several colleagues, we went to 6 of these communities, and we probably visited those towns 4 or 5 times each in these 6 communities to do structured interviews with people about what they thought about their community. We talked with leaders, we talked with people that ran organizations, et cetera, to really find out, rather than just what the survey data said, what is it like to live in these shared leader towns, and what is it like to live in these closed leadership towns? So with that, I have a number of charts to show you. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to, you'll have access to this presentation. You can go back and look at it at your leisure. There's also a couple extension bulletins about this that kind of explain the methods in more detail. So first is that what we find is that in towns that are characterized by shared leadership, that their people in these towns rate their leaders as much more open-minded. They see them as more trustworthy than untrustworthy. They see their leaders as building teams rather than as kind of being divisive or sort of alienating individuals in the town. And of course, they get things done. They're effective. And so those are the most important components. But you can see from the chart that the blue bar are the means or the averages in the shared leader towns, and then the red bars are the averages for the closed leadership towns. So this is how we kind of created this definition, that shared leaders are open-minded, they're trustworthy, they build teams, they're effective, they don't want to concentrate power, but really they share power, meaning they kind of delegate tasks to more people. They're informed, so they know about the issues and they read about it, and they're inclusive. They really want to bring people into the process rather than keeping it closed. So the next slide is, what does it mean for quality of life? And what this research has shown is that shared leadership towns have higher quality local services. So what we do in our surveys is we ask local residents, how would they rate on a 5-point scale from very poor to very good, or to excellent, I should say, how would they rate the quality of their local services? And again, the blue bars are the shared leadership towns, and the red bars are the closed leadership towns. And what we find is that on almost every measure of quality of life, engaging in the shared leadership makes people think that the quality of their local services are good. So close to 85% of people in shared leadership towns think the local government provides good quality services. Shared leadership towns think that the child care facilities and services are of high quality. It's lower in the closed towns. They think that there's quality job opportunities in their community. That's a huge one in small towns. So shared leadership can help develop good quality jobs. Housing is rated better. And so we see on a lot of these measures that, leadership just results in better services for the community. And why better services matters is that, if you're a smaller community, besides where someone's going to work, the next decision is, do I want to live in this town or not, based on the quality of the services? Is the housing stock good? Are the schools good? Is the government good? Are there good daycares and senior services for people that are dependent on me? Oftentimes people choose to live in one community or another community based on the quality of life and the quality of services in that town. So that's absolutely critical to make sure that your town has good quality services. Now, what we do find is that the gap between the shared leadership and the closed leadership towns begin to narrow once it gets to large organizations such as K through 12 education or healthcare services, and largely because that's not really within local control. That's regulated by the state. They sometimes are owned by outside entities. So it's local leaders have less influence on services that are provided by government or by state government or by outside entities like the local hospital. All right. Shared leadership communities are also are places where people can get involved, where there's more open governance. And so you look at the first line on that chart is that almost 2/3 of people in shared leadership towns think their local, trust their local officials, and that's 37% in closed leadership towns. I mean, that's really kind of amazing when you think about it, when so few people sort of trust elected officials, that engaging in this shared leadership really generates trust in your elected officials. And that's what you want. You want to be able to trust your local officials, elected officials, because they're leading your community. And if they say that here's a project, that here's a need we need to address, if the community trusts their leaders, they're more likely to get behind that leader and address that issue. Shared leadership towns make the community more welcoming and make people get more involved. So involved residents are much more likely to contribute their time and money to projects. And as I mentioned earlier, small towns face limited resources. They don't have enough people and they don't have enough money. And so making sure people are willing to get involved in the community and feel like they can get involved just as a way to generate more volunteers and more money. So, for example, on the second line of that chart, people in shared leadership towns think their organizations work for everybody, work for the interests of all people in the community. And I think we all know examples of community where, local non-government organizations are only there to benefit the business community or the Main Street community or older residents. We all have examples. But that's important. And the two ones that I really like are shared leadership towns do a very good job of integrating new residents into local organizations, that new residents are welcome to join local clubs and organizations, and more importantly, that new residents are welcome as leaders. So we think about that in a small town. You're a newcomer, you just moved to town, and here's a community that's willing to allow you to be a leader. Most small towns, particularly the small town that I grew up in, maybe if you've been in the town 25 years, then maybe you have a chance of becoming a local leader. More often, you had to be there 30 years of your entire life. And so, again, having this shared leadership makes people, newcomers, feel more welcome to try their role at leadership. And you never know, you might have a very dynamic leader, and they feel like that they're able to do that. So this is, again, open governance, getting people involved in the community. That's all very key for improving quality of life. And I think, besides, we think about quality of life in terms of the jobs and the housing and the healthcare system and the schools. All that is important. But the other component of quality of life is, is it a town you want to live in? No one wants to move to a town that's apathetic, that people feel very negative, that they feel that the town is declining. But what we find in these shared leadership towns, there is this, what I call it, so it's this can-do spirit and a very welcoming tone. So that very first line is that in the shared leadership, communities, close to 75% of the residents in that town think that their small town has more going for it than other towns of a similar size. I mean, that's a lot of confidence. I mean, that is a pretty clear indication that people in these communities think their town has a future. And when people think there's a future for their town, they're willing to invest in it. I mean, no one's going to contribute a lot of their time and money if they think the town is dying. Other indicators, other people believe that the whole community gets behind these projects. They're more attached to the community. They'd be less willing to leave. They'd be sorry to leave. They feel like it's a close group of friends. So all of that really leads to a very good quality of life beyond just the services. Is it a town that you want to live in? And is it a community you want to be a part of? The third bullet I have on here is some other statistics that are not on the chart. But in terms of the physical upkeep of the community, these shared leadership towns, just about 2/3 of people in the town said that their community was kept up in the shared leadership town versus only 23%. So these closed leadership towns are a little more run down. And then open to new ideas, the shared leadership towns say that their community, over 1/3 of people say their communities are open to new ideas. And in the closed leadership town, I mean, that's not a typo, that's 1%. In these closed leadership towns, almost nobody thinks their town is open to new ideas. So if you're not open to any new ideas, it's going to be very hard to address the challenges your community faces. And the shared leadership can facilitate this. All right. So I do have some other things I want to talk about besides just going through charts. This is pretty simple and straightforward that, as you might suspect, of everything I've said so far, is that people in shared leadership towns are just, they volunteer more, and they volunteer multiple times. So you get people to actually show up for projects, to lend a hand, to volunteer their time or their money for a project. And lastly, and this is again was very surprising in our research, we found that towns that have this shared leadership style, they're growing. Population grew 8% between 2010 and 2020. That's huge for small town. These are, most of these towns are, 2,000 to 2,500 people. Where in closed leadership towns, it fell by 4%. The prime aged workforce grew. So that 25 to 64, that's kind of the labor force that you want to attract to your community. That grew by 17% in these shared leadership towns. There's what we call a baby boom. There's a lot of kids, 8% gain in kids under 18 versus a 10% loss in the closed leadership town. So these towns are growing, and they're growing with young people, kids, which tends to indicate that younger families are moving. And we think why that is that they have good quality services. There's a lot of confidence in the town. People are very positive about the community. And there's opportunities for younger people to take a leadership role and have some say in the community. And then the other ones near the bottom just show that these towns tend to be, are better developed economically than other communities. So usually when I get to this point in the presentation, people sit and begin to say, well, all right, Peters has shown us all these charts and slides, and it's great. And he's talking about the shared leadership concept, but it's sort of it's 30,000 feet in the air. It's very abstract. And so the questions I usually get at this point are, all right, you've convinced me that the shared leadership, you're calling it, it works. So tell me, how do you actually do this? How does that happen? If I were to go back to my community on a Monday morning, start this, how would I do that? What specific steps should I take? And I would say two things. One, particularly relevant for this conference, is that we found that local libraries can play a key role in getting people to become leaders and to get engaged in the community. And secondly, there are some very concrete steps you can take to promote shared leadership and engagement in your community. So first, I'm going to talk about how libraries play a pretty critical role. And so when I ran these numbers, I was pretty shocked actually about the results I found. So what I found is that communities where large numbers of the people frequently visit their libraries, and so if you think about this, if you have frequent library users, which I defined as people that visit their library at least once a month or more, and most people visit their libraries, 2 to 3 times a month. It's usually not weekly, but it's 2 to 3 times a month. So people that are more actively visiting the library are more engaged in local organizations and are more likely to be leaders than people that don't frequently use the library. And so here's the chart. And so a few notes about the chart. The dark blue line represents small communities under 1,500. And the orange bar represents larger towns of over 3,000. Because I wanted to see if there was a difference between really small communities and larger towns. And this is ranked ordered by how much more library users are active in local groups than non-users. And so what I found is that people that frequently use the library are really the ones that keep the cultural life of a small town alive. They're the ones that are active in theater groups, art groups, music groups. I mean, that's absolutely key if you want to preserve the local water tower or a town mural or any kind of artwork on Main Street. It's more likely the library users are going to be involved in that. And this cultural aspect, the aesthetics of the town is so important. Secondly, that people that are more active in the library are the ones that are more involved in civic and service organizations. And so in small towns, if you think about a town of 1,000 people, city government is pretty limited. The ability of city government to do a lot of things is limited because they just don't have the property tax base to do that. So really what makes local towns work are people in economic development groups, community foundations, Kiwanis clubs, Lions Club, Rotary clubs. They're really ones that are really kind of generate and kind of lead projects and get things done. And so if you really want to get people engaged in community organizations, getting them to the library is probably a good first step. Get them to the library, get them involved in the town, get them meeting other people who are involved in the community, and kind of getting people into the library. Again, we can't say it's causal, but getting people into the library is strongly associated with those people then being involved in local organizations later on. And so you can read down the chart. Basically, if you go to the library a lot, you're involved in just about every organization in the community more than non-users. In terms of leadership, we see that frequent library users are much more likely to have held appointed leadership positions in their community and elected leadership positions in their community. So again, if you want to develop leaders, or you want to find good leaders, good shared leaders, good leaders that subscribe to the shared leadership model, I would say one of the first places you should look are who's at the library, who's using the library. That's usually a pretty good start according to what we have here. Secondly, people that use the library a lot participate more in local projects than those that don't use the library. So again, if you need to get volunteers for projects, getting people to the library, if you can get them in the library and keep them going to the library, that's usually a nice pool of volunteers to contribute their time and efforts to projects. So the numbers are pretty staggering. 62% of frequent library users participated in at least one or volunteered in at least one project last year versus only 36% of non-users. And if you look at those that volunteered 3 or more times in the last year, 37% of library users do that. So again, your volunteer base is really the people who come into the library. Other kind of indicators of note that those that are more likely to go to the library are much more, 40% of those people are involved or much more involved in local issues and affairs. 50% say they participate actively in projects versus only 25% for non-users. And they basically find the time, they find the interest, and they find ways to get involved. And so if you've done any kind of volunteering, and a lot of you, either are on library boards or work for the library that kind of works in cooperation with the library boards, it's hard to get people involved. It's hard to get people to show up to meetings, to volunteer. People give a lot of excuses. I don't have the time, or I'm not interested, or I don't know how to do it. Well, libraries can play a critical role for demonstrating the need for people to participate and also getting the word out that here are the projects that we need people to participate in. All that is very important, and libraries are a great way to make that happen. Be mindful of the time. This is just a quick slide about the demographic profile of who uses the libraries and who does not use libraries in small towns. Some of this won't come as much of a shock to a lot of you at the conference. People that tend to use libraries more than non-users, they tend to be women, families with children, and retirees. That makes sense. But interesting, we did find some interesting finding is that in larger towns, so towns of 3,000 to 6,000 people, we found that Latinos are much more likely to use the library than non-Latinos. And so that is an interesting finding, in that if your town is rapidly diversifying, and most smaller communities in Iowa, that is the most fastest growing part of the population, is the Latino population. This group tends to use the library a lot more. So that might have implications on the kinds of materials that you have, or maybe having some language competencies or some cultural competencies for this new group of users. In smaller towns, on the other hand, lower income people tend to use the library more. So, I mean, that's good. You want to make sure that individuals that are low to moderate income, that they see the library as a useful resource, either for internet or to acquire books, or for researching things that they might not be able to do at home because of income constraints. And of course, the larger problem that I haven't read is that younger people and people that are new to the community tend to not use the library as much. Okay, so some specific strategies on how you can basically create, or how do you facilitate good leadership, shared leadership that really results in positive community and economic development outcomes. So when we did these case studies, we went into 3 communities that were characterized as shared leadership and interviewed a lot of people. And we went into 3 communities that had this closed leadership. And we did a bunch of interviews, and we kind of looked at all that information and tried to do a compare and contrast. And what did we see that was distinct about the shared versus the closed leadership communities? And one was on how leadership was structured. So in the shared leadership towns, we found that there wasn't 1 or 2 key leaders. There were a whole bunch of leaders, that the leadership structure was very decentralized. There were leaders on various different projects. They were all engaged in different activities, but the key difference is they all cooperated and they all met together on a fairly regular basis. So there were far more leaders in these shared leadership towns. Whereas in the closed leadership town, there was only maybe 1 or 2 key leaders, and they made all decisions, and they were usually people on city council or the mayor. Whereas in the shared leadership towns, you had just different kinds of people leading different projects. So in shared leadership towns, it's sort of very decentralized. Also, what we found in these shared leadership towns is existing leaders really tried to create spaces for new leaders, and they tried to really groom or mentor up-and-coming leaders to sort of take future leadership positions. And so what we found, it was kind of amazing, that in these shared leadership towns, these are sometimes towns of 500 people, you had women, you had new residents, you had a lot of younger people getting involved. And kind of when we did the interviews in a lot of these shared leadership towns, the older leaders said, well, our job is simply to sit back and sign the checks, and we let the younger people decide what needs to be done because it matters more to them. So you had the situation of older leaders stepping aside and really creating that opportunity for younger leaders, and more importantly, encouraging that. So the older leaders really mentoring newer and younger leaders, sharing credit, and really, kind of giving their blessing. I think that for many of you in small towns, you realize that, if you've had a group of leaders that have been involved for a very long time and you want to step in that leadership role, sometimes you feel like you haven't been given permission to do that. And so a lot of what these shared leadership communities are doing is that the older leaders are stepping aside and basically giving their blessing, or saying, yes, it's okay. We support, we as the old leadership are very supportive of new people, taking the community in a different direction. All right. You can read the last 2 things: accepting of risk, accepting the risk of new ideas, trying different things, even if they seem like very oddball topics, but really just discussing any kind of idea. Whereas in the closed leadership towns, people were really afraid of failing. So failure really wasn't a concern in these shared leadership towns. I remember one guy, the mayor said, well, we're going to try a lot of things. A lot of things won't work, but eventually we'll find something that does. And people were just very unconcerned if projects didn't work out the way they thought. Also, ways to encourage leaders is to really structure that leadership for, not 1953, but 2023. And just, being very sensitive to that people have families, people have jobs, people have busy lives. How can you really structure leadership in a way that allows it to fit in people's schedules? Now, not just assuming that everyone has the time to do it. All right. The last things I want to say on this slide is that, the leaders we found that the leaders in these shared leadership towns really had kind of two different, they kind of had two things. They were two things at the same time. One, they were a champion for their town, so their town's biggest cheerleader. They were very optimistic, but they also were ones that they were conveners. So the most important, influential people in the community were ones that really didn't do the projects, and they didn't have a lot of formal power, but they were the town's biggest advocate, and they saw their role as connecting all these different groups and leaders together. By contrast, in the shared leadership town, they didn't have a leader. They kept talking about like ghosts. We say that they kept talking about what the town was 30 years ago. And so used to be here. Or we used to have this, talking about things that no longer exist. And that apathy in the community became very contagious. And the same thing about not being a convener in a lot of the closed leadership towns. A lot of people wanted to do it all. They wanted to have total control. And so they weren't really interested in working with different groups. So oftentimes you had competing groups, or you had just one person, making all the decisions. And the last thing I want to say about this is that, there's a lot of thinking in the leadership literature about, we used to think about leaders as something we need to train an individual for, that the leader has these qualities and we need to send the leader to training, and that it's the leader that is going to make things happen. And the thinking's changed a little bit in that really good leadership should be a community norm, that it should be the community reinforcing good leadership. And so leaders come and go, but what you want is a community that says, we all agree that we think this is what good leaders ought to be, and we're going to select leaders that fit those characteristics. And when leaders deviate from that, we're going to let them know. So really having leaders as, that follow these community norms. And so what we found in these shared leadership towns, that most people kind of agreed that leaders should be there should be conveners, they should be very open, they should, step aside when they need to. And that we found that, for example, business leaders would allow their workers to take time off to be a leader in their community. The city, they would really try to go out of the way to hire good leaders, even paying more than what they would want. And so that was an important component to that as well. So again, these really maybe aren't, kind of very specific kinds of strategies, but it gives you an idea of how these towns have gone about doing this. Like, how would you actually start the process of doing this? And the important thing is that a lot of these shared leadership towns, we found they weren't always that way, that oftentimes it happened in as little as 5 years, that things turned around in 5 or 6 years, that there just was a decision that we have to do something to get our town back on track. And it sort of happened. All right, so I've been talking for 45 minutes. I only meant to talk for a half hour. But you know how professors are. But I do want to leave you with a story that I think just exemplifies the role that libraries can play in sort of the leadership of sort of leading a community and making a community a welcoming place that people want to live in. And that would be the town of Eagle Grove, which I kind of titled A Library of Love, or a library board full of love. So just a little bit of context. I was asked in late 2018 to do 2 community facilitations and discussions in Eagle Grove about the upcoming opening of the Prestige hog processing facility. Now, the processing facility opened in 2019. It's a very impressive facility. It's 700,000 square feet. I think the nameplate capacity is something like 10,000 head. Was going to, at full capacity, to employ 1,000 people. I think they haven't quite gone up to full capacity yet, but they're close to it now. And then the biggest kind of concern was that the labor force working at the plant, about 43 to 50% were expected to be people of color or workers of color. So that was a lot of concern for people in the community. So I was asked to come in to talk about that. I had some research on kind of what has happened in other communities in the past. And so I facilitated 2 community discussions. They were in the middle school auditorium. There were 2 sessions. One was very, very large, well attended, packed, and the other one was sort of less attended. But anyway, so I gave my presentation talking about, kind of the challenges and opportunities related to having a large number of newcomers in the community. A lot of the discussions were contentious. Again, this is in 2018, kind of in the middle of President Trump's term, when there were immigration issues swirling around, and people were worried about issues of crime and the quality of the schools. And so there was a lot of just general angst in the community, just because their town was going to change pretty drastically, and people were unsettled by it, which is entirely legitimate and expected. And so the whole process was meant to talk about it and try to for people to express their concerns and try to understand what's happened in other communities. Well, particularly in the second very well attended presentation, in the very front row, there was this group of about 6 older individuals, retired people, they looked like to me, that sat quietly and patiently. The discussion was finished, and I had about 20 minutes talking with people afterwards, and they kind of stayed around. And so finally, when people began to clear out of the auditorium in the middle school, they came up to me and they said, "Well, we'd like to ask you a question." I said, "Absolutely." And they said, "Well, we were wondering if you could get someone from the Spanish department," they said, "to come up to Eagle Grove and to teach us Spanish." And I said, "Okay, sure, I'd be happy to do that." And then I said, "Well, if you don't mind me asking, what are you just interested in learning Spanish?" And they said, "No." Well, I said, "Yes and no," but they said, "Our main interest in this is that we're all on the library board, and we've been talking about how the library can play a role in kind of helping the community go through this transition." And their idea was to put together an after-school reading program for English as a second language learners, ESL students, so they can come after they go to school, come to the library, work on their reading in English, work on the speaking, and just really kind of just get engaged in the town. And they wanted to know some Spanish so they could talk to the kids, talk to the parents of the kids. They wanted to know what were some good books that they should start looking to buy that were in Spanish and in English, to sort of make sure that the kids could still read in their native language as well as in English. And they were really earnest about what they wanted to do, and it wasn't self-serving. They just really felt that they wanted to help their community, and they wanted to have a way to have new people come into the town and feel welcome, so they felt like they could have a home, and they felt this is the one thing that we can do. And I just remember, this is in 2018 now, being just very struck by it, just because the rhetoric of the time is that all of rural Iowa or the rural Midwest were very anti-immigrant, and people were very mean. And that was sort of the impression you got reading the national the national media. And then here I was in Eagle Grove with the exact opposite. I thought it was just a very empowering story that we don't get often told, and I just thought it was very telling that it was the library doing this. And I think this story just, I think, exemplifies the need for libraries. Obviously there's a need for access to the internet and books and reading, sort of those utilitarian things, but I think we tend to forget of the library as sort of an organization and an institution that could promote broader things that we might not think about, or they might be a resource that can address an issue that no one ever really thought about. I'm sure no one ever thought that the Eagle Grove Library would be at the forefront of sort of integrating people into the community, but that's what happened. So just the importance of the library in the community and the role it can serve of bringing people together. And I followed up probably over in 2019, then COVID hit, I wasn't able to go up there, and I tried to follow as best I could on social media. But it seems, from the pictures I have, they, do plenty of events, and it seems to be that, the Latino kids are kind of mixing with the kids that have grown up there. So we have 10 minutes left. I don't want to keep people too long, and I want to allow some time for questions. But I thought it was just a very powerful story of just, the role libraries can serve in a community, and the people engaged in libraries, their approach to the community development is so needed, I think, in any community, but particularly in smaller communities. So I just thought I'd share that story with you. All right, so I'm not going to the next slide for some reason. Here it is. Okay, so I'm just going to open it up for questions, or Bonnie or Sam can open it up for questions. Feel free to reach out to me. I have a bunch of small extension bulletins that are easy to read. Happy to talk more about it. And thank you for your time, and thank you for staying till near 7 o'clock to hear me talk.
Well, David, I just want to thank you so much for this. This was quite the bookend performance here, from our morning keynote to an evening keynote. Some of us were commenting in the chat space when you were sharing the data from the survey, just how affirming those numbers are for all of us in library land. You know, we're all thinking, well, yeah, we get it, but it's just so affirming to have it confirmed like that in the work that you do. So that was especially cool to see. This is a quick question that I think Sam she's such a sleuth, she may have found this already, but in the 6 towns that you mentioned visiting, in the data itself, do you name names of those specific towns, or?
No, we don't. I mean,
okay.
Our point isn't to shame towns, and our point isn't to make certain towns feel like that they're deficient in some way. So we really don't name the towns. We know about it as a research community, and if another researcher reached out, we would likely share the names. But our goal isn't to point out particular towns. Now we will share the names of towns that are successful. Usually we ask them to say, well, do you mind if someone asks, well, where are these shared leadership communities? Do you mind if we mention? Usually they don't have any problem with that. But
okay.
The closed leader towns, we would never publicly do that. There's no point of doing that.
All right. Well, this is a deep question, and it may not have a real easy answer, but someone asked for suggestions for how to encourage the closed leadership places to begin to think differently, and maybe strategies for, steering the ship in the better direction of being shared leadership communities.
I think that, so in some of the interviews we did, a lot of the issues that you have entrenched leaders that don't want to let go. And I'm talking people that have been in a leadership, not lived in the town, but been in a leadership position 30 or more years. I mean, this is insane. That they just don't want to step aside, and the community just feels some obligation, or it's hard to explain. So what would do it? I think one would be a crisis. There's some crisis that really is that we need to change the leadership. I would say if I were doing, so what we tried to do, we haven't been able to work it, is getting people from shared, so peer to peer. So like in some of the communities that are closed leadership towns, they're usually very older leaders in the community. What we wanted to do is get some older leaders, older men from the shared leadership towns that have stepped aside, and just bring them together, or meet, bring for coffee, and just have, from one older white guy that used to be a leader to another older, white guy that was a leader, just to tell their story of how, I stepped aside and great things happened. And it's phenomenal. I think maybe it's this fear of, in the closed leadership towns, this fear of giving up control, that I don't know what's going to happen. And then really, I think hearing from other people like them, like older leaders that have been around, and they said, I stepped aside and it was difficult for me and I might not have liked it, but I did it for the good of my community. And we have all these interesting things happening, and people are coming to our town. I think if I were to do it, and if I could wave a magic wand and get them together, that's how I would approach it, rather than just having me give a presentation and finger wagging. That's not going to do it. Oftentimes, hearing from someone that they think is a peer or like them, that has kind of stepped aside, I think that can be, those stories I think are very powerful. That's, I think, what changes people's hearts and minds when you tell that story. So that would be my response.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. I think that's a great insight. It's like testimonials, really, right? Experience testimonials. When we did this in our town, this is what changed for the better.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Yes. Well, we are very nearly out of time. Remember that this recording and Dave's slides will be posted in Iowa Learns and elsewhere. The recording will make its way to our continuing education YouTube channel. And we will have another small little packet of accompanying slides that Sam and I put together as we were prepping for ILOC this year, and specifically for tonight. Sam and I started talking about ways in which library boards could ensure that community members, whether newcomers or longtime residents, could become more involved in the library scene, and in that way become more involved in the community. So we have some thoughts about that, complete with some great examples from our Iowa libraries like Lehigh and West Des Moines and Waterloo. So we will share our modest packet of slides to accompany Dave's as well with this presentation. So with that, I want to thank you so very much, David, for spending your time this way and for giving us this really inspiring and affirming conclusion to ILOC 2023.